In Joshua 5, there's a really interesting story I'd like to go over today that I think we can draw out some practical lessons from for our own lives, but also the story is just really interesting and not one that gets covered too often. I think that's probably because it sits right between two other famous stories, namely the Exodus and wilderness travels of the Israelites and the taking of Jericho. And this story in Joshua 5 is just right in between those two things, but it's just so singular and very strange in a way. But I do think there's really cool implications for our own lives that we can take out from this story. So I'll set the scene for you a little bit before we get going. Israel is on the cusp of the promised land. They're just about to inherit the promises of God that they've been waiting for years after wandering the wilderness. In fact, the old generation of Israelites has died in the wilderness because of their sins. God says, because you disobeyed me and broken covenant with me, you will not see the promised land, but I'll still be faithful to you. The next generation, your children, will enter into that promised land. And so this is the generation we have now, right before they're about to go in and start conquering people and taking over cities for themselves. And so this new generation is younger, they are strong, they've grown up in the wilderness, they've gone through hardship and difficulty, they know each other, they've worked together before to overcome certain things, they're reliant on God, and they're a huge amount of people. They are a force to be reckoned with. And they're gathering just on the edge of the promised land, looking into the city of Jericho. And they have a certain vitality about them that is seen by Jericho even from a long way away. You'll remember from the story of Rahab that she says she's heard of all the things that Israel's God has done for them when they were in Egypt. The stories have traveled fast and far, and they are aware that God has helped them through supernatural means. And so the city of Jericho is a little bit terrified, not only of the huge military presence that's just on the outskirts of their town, but also of the God that leads these people and the amazing things that he can do for them. There's also one more thing worth noting, and that is that Israel, in this newer generation, before they enter into the promised land, are recommitting themselves to God. At the beginning of this chapter, they are all getting circumcised and recommitting to the covenant that Israel has been under this whole time, saying, yes, we will obey God, we will follow him into this land, we will do what he tells us to, and we will conquer where he tells us to conquer. And so they are taking the name of Israel very, very seriously and rededicating themselves to being God's people. They're under his authority. They're under his name. They see themselves as his army, and they're about to go and conquer the land that he's promised for them with a certain gusto that the older generation might not have been able to do. And so they're ready, and Jericho sees them afar off, and they're a little bit afraid. It says the people of Jericho stayed inside. They did not go out of their homes for fear of the people of God that were just about to take them over. And you can imagine this scene, Jericho kind of locked down, Israel looking out over this first city thinking, this is the first place we take over, this is where our God is leading us, this is where his promises come to fulfillment. They're excited and they're eager. And Joshua, who's been leading Israel since Moses, looks out over the city. And as he's surveying it, he sees a man. And this man is standing there with a sword drawn. This man must have been someone impressive because Joshua asks him a question that might be read with some sort of timidity. He says, are you for us or for our adversaries? And this person who calls himself the commander of the army of the Lord answers one word, neither. Now, this is very strange, because if this is the commander of the army of the Lord, and you have Israel standing here who considers themselves the army of the Lord, wouldn't the commander of that army be in favor of them or be for them? And yet the answer is neither. I am not for you or for them, your adversaries. I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now, what on earth are we supposed to make of this? Well, I think there's a lot here. It's certain that this commander of the army of the Lord is in fact God himself. He is the one who would become Jesus Christ, and he actually, I think, bears some resemblance to the person of Jesus Christ that we meet in the Gospels. You remember often Jesus is tempted and tested by these legalistic Pharisees or scribes or Sadducees. He gets asked these trick questions to trap him. And often he's put in a position where he has to answer one way or another, and they know that if he answers either way, they can trap him in something. They can call him a sinner. They can delegitimize him in the eyes of people. But instead, Jesus answers in ways they never expect, and he kind of gets out of their trickery by answering more truthfully than they ever could have imagined. You'll remember the Pharisees ask him, "By what authority are you doing these things?" when he cleanses the temple and tips over the tables of the money changers. And he doesn't answer, well, by God's authority or by the authority of some spiritual force. Instead, he says, "I'm going to answer your question with a question. Answer me this, and I'll answer you your question." And so they're like, "Oh man, like we're kind of lost here. We're trapped in our own game." Or the Pharisees ask him, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" And Jesus answers, "Go ahead and pay taxes to Caesar, but the more important question is, have you paid to God what belongs to God?" And again, the Pharisees are trapped in their own game. And so here Joshua asks a similar question, "Are you for us or for them, our adversaries?" And the commander of the Lord's army replies, "Neither." But this begs the question, how? How could the commander of the Lord's army not be for or with Israel? How is that possible? They're his promised people. They have just recommitted themselves to him. They're being directed by him. The following battle, in fact, is given into the hands of Israel. In the very next chapter, it says, "I've given this city over to you." So doesn't this mean that the commander of the Lord's army is, in fact, for Israel? Not in the way we might think. This is God. He has created all of mankind. He is working for and on behalf of all of us. This is something that we really need to remember when we're thinking about God, because we often get so tribal about things. It's our tendency to do this. It's an us versus them mentality, and this kind of runs rampant in different churches or denominations, or from person to person, or people with this idea versus that idea. We love to be part of a group and part of a team, and we love to align our team with God. And we think God is for us because we are with him, and this must mean he's against them, who we also are against. But this is not correct thinking. God, in his capacity as a military commander, does not position himself against the city of Jericho just because they don't belong to his chosen people. He looks at them and he still sees people. Joshua looks at the city and thinks, how is the city fortified? How many people are there? What do we have to do to overcome them? The commander of the Lord's army looks at this city and sees Rahab ready to join his people. He sees people that he desires to have a part of his family someday. He sees people that he formed in their mother's womb with love and consideration and care. And even in his deliverance of this city militarily over into the hands of Israel, he is not against them. Now, it's true, we do set ourselves against God with sin, but even in that, Jesus has proven that he was still for us, in that while we were still sinners, he died for all of us. In Matthew 16, there's a really interesting story where Jesus stands at a pagan temple at the outskirts of the borderlands of Israel and says that the gates of hell that he's literally standing in front of will not prevail against the church that he is sending forward in an offensive attack against it. The gates of hell, remember, it's not like, we read this scripture and we think, okay, the gates of hell won't prevail against God's people, won't prevail against the church, and so the gates of hell must be on the attack. But this doesn't make sense. The gates of any city are the defensive weapon, and he's saying, I'm sending you out against the gates of hell, and you are going to overcome them. It's a military offensive that he's sending his church on. These are military marching orders, and those that take up that call are led by that same commander of the army of the Lord. Warfare language throughout the Bible is used to depict the walk that Christians are on. As we go throughout this world, it's overrun by evil. But I want to ask the question, when we consider the people of the world, it can be so natural to have this almost PTSD response to them. And so do we consider ourselves against them? We're on the lookout for evil that might overtake us or harm those around us. We see evil and we think this is against the God that we love. This is in direct contradiction to his goodness and his love. We hate that. We want that evil to be gone. And so often we see the people that are doing evil and we turn them into the objects of our hatred rather than the objects of our pity. Now, yes, in reality, like in cases of people committing crimes or whatever, there are consequences that need to come with the sins that are committed. This is good. This is right. This sense of justice is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we look at the world and consider ourselves soldiers under the authority of the commander of the Lord's army, if we were asked that same question that Joshua asked him, are you for God's people or are you for those in the world? How would we reply? It might be automatic that we answer, of course we're for God's people. Of course we're against the world, because the world stands for sin. It stands for evil. But this is not the answer our commander gave. We should not be so quick to reply either or. We're for them and against them, because the commander of the army we claim to be a part of answered Joshua in this same question with one word: neither.